By late 1943, the air war over Europe had reached its most dangerous point. Every daylight mission flown by the U.S. 8th Air Force came with staggering losses. German air defenses had grown ruthless, and bomber crews knew that once they crossed the coastline, their survival depended on discipline, formation flying, and a bit of luck. Among the young men stationed in England was Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old pilot from West Virginia. He'd trained for months to fly the B-17 Flying Fortress, the heavy bomber America believed could strike deep into Germany and still bring its crew home. On paper, the plane was invincible. In reality, very few crews ever finished their required missions. On the morning of December 20th, 1943, Brown and his crew prepared for their first combat flight. The target was Bremen, a vital industrial city producing Focke-Wulf fighter aircraft. Hitting it meant flying straight into one of the most heavily defended regions of northern Germany. At dawn, the airfield buzzed with activity. Ground crews loaded bombs and ammunition while the pilots gathered for final briefing. The officers reminded them to hold formation no matter what happened. Stragglers became targets, and anyone left alone rarely made it home. Brown's aircraft, nicknamed Ye Old Pub, took off shortly after 8. It joined a vast formation of hundreds of bombers climbing into the cold winter sky. Inside, the crew checked oxygen lines and heated flight suits as frost crept across the windows. They were quiet. Everyone understood what waited ahead. Crossing the North Sea, the first sign of danger appeared. Thin bursts of black smoke in the distance. German flak batteries had already spotted them. The closer they came to Bremen, the heavier the explosions became. Concussions rocked the aircraft. Shrapnel rattled off the metal skin like hailstones. The smell of cordite filled the cabin. Despite the chaos, Brown kept the bomber steady. It was his duty to drop their bombs exactly on target. Around them, other B-17s began taking hits. One plane disintegrated in a flash. Another spiraled toward the ground, trailing smoke. The crew of Ye Olde Pub pressed on, engines straining as the formation reached the target zone. At exactly noon, they released their payload. The bombs tumbled through clouds and vanished in distant bursts. Almost immediately, Brown turned the aircraft west, beginning the long flight home. But Bremen's defenders were not finished. Within minutes, the German fighters arrived. Dozens of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s streaked through the formation, their 20mm cannons spitting fire. Brown's plane was hit almost at once. Flak had already damaged one engine. Now another began to fail. The nose gunner was wounded. The tail section took multiple hits, severing control cables and tearing open the fuselage. Oxygen hoses ruptured, frost forming instantly on the walls. Still, the crew fought back. The remaining machine guns fired in short, controlled bursts. But there were simply too many attackers. One by one, the defensive guns went silent as men were hit or weapons jammed. The bomber fell behind the group, its engines coughing black smoke. When the last German fighter broke away, Ye Olde Pub was alone. 2 engines were dead, a third barely holding on. The top turret gunner lay unconscious. The radio operator was badly hurt. Through holes in the fuselage, Brown could see the countryside below. Enemy territory in every direction. He considered ordering the crew to bail out, but 2 of them were too injured to move. The others refused to leave them. Brown tightened his grip on the control column. If there was any chance of keeping the aircraft in the air, he would try to fly it back himself. The bomber limped northward at barely 150 miles per hour. Every vibration threatened to tear the wing off. Fuel leaked from punctured lines. The cold bit through their flight suits. Inside the cockpit, the noise was deafening. Wind, engine strain, and the whine of damaged metal. As they crossed over a patchwork of snow-covered fields, Brown caught sight of something glinting in the distance. A small single-engine aircraft climbing toward them. At first he thought it was one of theirs, maybe a P-47 escort that had found them. A second later, he realized the truth. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 was coming up fast. The German pilot closing in was Franz Stigler, a 28-year-old Luftwaffe ace stationed near Bremen. He'd already survived hundreds of missions and had 22 aerial victories to his name. To most Allied airmen, he would have been the image of a cold-blooded hunter. But that morning, Stigler wasn't hunting, at least not yet. He had just refueled and rearmed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 when he heard the air raid sirens wailing over the field. A group of American bombers was retreating from Bremen, and several reports mentioned a straggler trailing smoke. Stigler's commanding officer pointed him toward the runway. "Finish it off," the officer said. "You'll get your 23rd kill." Stigler nodded, climbed into his cockpit, and took off. It didn't take long to find the crippled bomber. From miles away, he could see the trail of white vapor against the winter sky. The B-17 flew barely above the treetops, wobbling from side to side. One engine was frozen solid, another spitting flame. Stigler approached from behind, ready to fire. As he closed to within a few hundred yards, his gun sight lined up on the bomber's tail. But something stopped him. He eased off the trigger and looked closer. The tail gunner's position was destroyed. The rear guns hung limp, twisted by cannon shells. Through the holes in the fuselage, Stigler could see men moving slowly, some tending to the wounded. The plane looked like it had been through hell. He eased closer still, just off the left wingtip. Inside the cockpit, Charlie Brown glanced out and froze. A German fighter was right beside them, so close he could see the pilot's face through the glass canopy. The crew braced for the end. But instead of firing, the Germans simply looked at them. For several seconds, neither man moved. The silence in the sky was eerie, just the low rumble of engines and the whistle of wind through torn metal. Stigler gestured with his hand, pointing downward as if telling them to land. Brown shook his head. He knew landing in enemy territory meant capture. Stigler tried again, mouthing words they couldn't hear. When it became clear the Americans weren't giving up, Stigler made a decision that defied everything he'd been trained to do. He pulled his plane even closer and positioned himself just above and behind the bomber, a place that made it look, from the ground, like he was escorting it. German anti-aircraft gunners, seeing the 109 so close, held their fire. For several miles, the two planes flew side by side, one a battered fortress barely holding together, the other a sleek hunter choosing mercy over victory. Inside the bomber, Brown's crew watched in disbelief. "He's not shooting," one of them muttered. "What's he doing?" Brown couldn't answer. He could only stare at the German pilot, who had every reason to destroy them and hadn't. As they neared the North Sea, Stigler knew they were almost at the edge of German-controlled airspace. If he went any farther, he risked being shot down by Allied fighters or mistaken for the enemy by his own side. He looked across at the Americans one last time, raised his hand in a salute, and peeled away into the clouds. For a moment, Charlie Brown just sat there in shock. Then he turned to his co-pilot and said quietly, "I think he just saved our lives." The crew pressed on toward England. The bomber was barely flyable, and twice they nearly ditched into the sea, but by some miracle they crossed the coast and landed at an emergency airfield in Norfolk. When they climbed out, the ground crew stared at the wreck. There were hundreds of holes across the wings and fuselage. One engine was gone entirely. A few more hits, and the plane would have fallen apart. Brown made his report, but when intelligence officers asked what had happened in the air, he hesitated. If he told them a German fighter had spared them, no one would believe it. Or worse, they'd think he was crazy. The story stayed quiet. Officially, it was recorded as enemy fighter disengaged for unknown reasons. Franz Stigler landed safely at his base and said nothing. Had his superiors learned what he'd done, he could have faced a court-martial or even execution. In Nazi Germany, mercy toward the enemy was treason. That night, he wrote in his logbook, "No victory today. No kill. I could not shoot at them. It would have been murder years past." The war continued to rage, cities burned, and millions died. Both men survived the conflict, but carried the memory of that moment for the rest of their lives. Charlie Brown returned home to the United States, haunted by what had happened. He couldn't shake the image of the German pilot's face, not one of hate, but of compassion. Stigler, meanwhile, struggled to rebuild his life in a broken country. He eventually moved to Canada, trying to leave the past behind. Neither man knew the other's name. For decades, Charlie Brown couldn't forget that day in 1943. He had flown dozens of missions after that, but nothing came close to the moment when an enemy fighter had chosen mercy instead of death. After the war, he returned home, got married, and built a life in Florida. Yet the image of the German pilot, the man who let him live, never faded. Every now and then, he'd bring it up in conversation with other veterans. Most would nod politely and say, "Maybe he ran out of ammo," or "You probably imagined it." But Brown knew what he saw: the salute, the escort, the decision. By the late 1980s, he was retired and still wondering if that pilot had survived the war. One evening, he decided to finally do something about it. He sat down at his desk and began to write a letter. It wasn't to anyone specific, just a description of the event. The bomber, the date, the location, and what had happened. He sent copies to every veteran organization, historical group, and Luftwaffe association he could find. Weeks passed, then months. Most replies were dead ends. No one recognized the story. But one day in 1990, a letter arrived from Canada. It was short, handwritten, and began with a sentence that stopped Brown cold. "Dear Mr. Brown, I was the one who escorted your B-17 out of Germany." The letter was signed Franz Stigler. Brown immediately called the number written at the bottom of the page. When Stigler answered, there was a long silence. Both men struggled to find words. After 46 years, they were finally speaking to the person who had once been their enemy and their savior. They talked for hours, comparing memories, verifying every detail. Stigler described the holes in the tail section, the wounded men he saw inside, and the exact direction the bomber had flown when he saluted goodbye. Every word matched perfectly. It was undeniable. This was the man. They agreed to meet in person. In the summer of 1990, Charlie Brown flew to Vancouver, Canada. When he stepped off the plane, he spotted Stigler waiting, tall, silver-haired, wearing a gentle smile. The two men walked toward each other and, without a word, embraced. Witnesses said they stood there for a long time, both crying quietly. From that day on, the two men became inseparable. They visited air shows together, shared their story at veteran gatherings, and often spent holidays side by side. Brown would later say, "Franz was like the big brother I never had." Stigler, in turn, once told a reporter, "Charlie was the reason I never lost faith in humanity." Their reunion made headlines across the world. Newspapers ran the story under titles like "Enemies Become Friends" and "The German Pilot Who Saved an American Crew." To many, it seemed almost unbelievable that in the middle of the most brutal war in history, two men had found a moment of peace. But for Brown and Stigler, it wasn't about fame. It was about closure. Both men had seen unspeakable things in the war, and this bond, this strange friendship born from mercy, gave them peace in their later years. When journalists asked Stigler why he hadn't pulled the trigger that day, he would answer the same way every time. I saw them as fellow men, not enemies. I couldn't have shot them. It would have been like shooting a man in a parachute. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler remained friends for nearly 2 decades. They called each other every week and visited whenever they could. Brown's family came to love Stigler as one of their own. In 2008, within just a few months of each other, both men passed away. Charlie Brown at 86, Franz Stigler at 92. When Stigler's family went through his belongings, they found a framed photo of Brown and his crew in their B-17. Below it, Stigler had written just 4 words: "My brother, my friend." Today, the story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown stands as one of the most powerful acts of humanity in war. Historians call it the Gentleman's Act, a moment that proved that even in the darkest times, compassion can still exist between enemies. Their encounter has been retold in books, documentaries, and classrooms across the world. And in aviation museums, side by side, 2 names are remembered not for how many enemies they killed, but for the one life they saved. Because sometimes, true heroism isn't in pulling the trigger, it's in choosing not to.